Okay, so hopefully you drew your arrows and now you'll see what happens. So bottom up is called propagation. And if you increase primary production, you can increase consumers, secondary consumers, and top consumers. You see increasing arrows going all the way up. Now that's very different from what happens if we increase tertiary consumers. If we increase the number of consumers at the very top of the food chain, that decreases the number of prey that they're eating because they're eating so many prey. And that prey then release pressure on the primary consumers so they go up. And because they go up, then primary producers go down. So this is called a trophic cascade. So you can see how, depending on whether the main input to the system is coming from the bottom or coming from the top, how the ecological consequences of that can be very drastic. Okay, and then some mutualisms. So here's some really cool mutualisms. We have ants living in acacia trees. So the ants provide protection. They attack any herbivore that tries to come and eat the acacia tree. And then the acacia produce these specialized chambers just for the ants. They produce nectar in these chambers, and the ants live their whole lives in these colonies within the tree itself. Or we have this eel at the bottom, right? An eel's a voracious predator. We would likely think of shrimp as a very tasty treat. But these cleaner shrimp have developed this relationship with the eel where they go in and they clean all the junk off the eel's teeth. And the eel lets it happen because they realize what a benefit it is to them to have clean teeth and fewer parasite loads themselves. Here's a classic study in ant-aphid interaction. So ants and aphids also have a really cool mutualistic relationship where the ants actually tend the aphids like little cows or sheep, and then they milk the aphids for the frass, which is basically the aphids are phloem suckers, so they're eating sugars from the plants, and then the waste they produce is like sugary, sappy stuff that the ants eat. And these folks, Hal Cushman and Tom Whittam, did this really neat experiment that's highlighted in your book, where basically they predicted that treehopper reproduction would be higher when ants are present than when ants are absent. And they concluded that treehoppers actually benefit from the interaction with ants, but only when jumping spiders are common. So when jumping spiders are common, the ants keep them away. When jumping spiders are rare, then the benefit is not as strong. Here's another interesting researcher, Gina Wimp, who worked with Tom Whittam on this really cool study where they removed aphids from trees, and they found that when aphids were removed, species richness and total abundance of other organisms went up. So aphids have this kind of overwhelming influence on the ecosystem, and ants and aphids in particular, right? When aphids are there and ants are present, the ants then can keep all of these other community members out of the picture. So there's a big debate in community structure. These folks are Frederick Clements and Edith Schwartz Clements. They were a married couple. Most textbooks talk only about Frederick, but Edith was an amazing botanist on her own, and she was the mechanic of the two. So here she's shown with their Model T car and how she basically kept all of the field work going and did these amazing plant studies herself. So early in the 1900s, they worked on plant communities all over the country. And they basically decided that communities were made up of associated plants that changed sequentially over time, and that plant succession over time would end in what's called a climax community. So you might have a pond and it slowly fills in, turns into a meadow, and then trees start growing, and eventually the trees would grow up and you'd end up with an old growth forest, and the old growth forest might be your climax community. They also put forward these ideas that species function together kind of like a superorganism. And so here's kind of an example of how they would imagine species kind of working together over time in these complex organisms. This is Gleason, Henry A. Gleason, and around the same period of time, he was working with plants and argued that each species responds individually to environmental gradients, and that communities do not function as superorganisms. And so his idea of what species might be distributed like would look more like this, kind of a more haphazard distribution of species across the environmental gradient as a whole. Now, these two are often, the Clements versus the Gleason is often set up as kind of a big debate, a big conflict, but there's a lot of truth to both of these ideas. And so today we take more of a middle road approach to these two extremes in terms of understanding how plant communities work. And there's lots of really neat current experiments in ecological succession. So this is an example from the book where they set up these big ponds. They filled them all at the same time with sterilized water. And then they just watched what organisms colonized. So spiders can float in. They're not really colonizing the water, I guess, but lots of organisms can drift in on clouds and land on, bird feet, and all of these little organisms, these aquatic organisms, somehow colonize these ponds. And they thought that, if you have 12 ponds in the same place, that identical plankton communities would develop in all 12 ponds. But what they really found was that about half of the species that were present appear in most or all of the ponds, but each pond has a unique community that developed. And so basically there's kind of a mixture of some things that might happen consistently, and then there's a lot more stochastic or just kind of random factors that can influence community succession. Here's an example of aquatic biomes and succession. So some ponds, especially ponds that have inlets, can start off as large open lakes, and then they slowly accumulate sediments and the surface area of the water shrinks, and then they fill in completely, turn into meadows, like I was talking about. And so lakes have these clear successional stages or sears. What's interesting is, as a stream ecologist, I've always thought, well, why don't we have any real, theories about streams and how they evolve? And it's partly because streams don't just fill in, right? They're constantly carving down. And so they're really, really old. So most streams are not created we don't have new streams on the landscape very often. We haven't really had a chance to watch new streams develop. But there are some places like up in Alaska where glaciers are retreating. There are streams that are being exposed. And so there are people who are studying kind of the colonization of those streams as they get exposed. And then I would just say that I've been doing some of this work at Mount St. Helens, where we had this massive eruption in 1980, and those streams that were there were covered with 300 feet of sterile pumice, and new streams formed, and we get to watch the development of those streams over time. And it's been interesting. It's kind of like the ponds. They're not developing in the same way. There's a lot more stochasticity to it, and a lot more is happening due to chance than we expected. Okay. So I'm going to pause the video one more time and try to keep these chunks short for you. So we're going to take a little break,